All right, let's move on to the state level of federalism and talk about the three branches of government on the state level. But before we do that, I actually got a question that you guys can think of in your head. I won't hold you to it. Do you remember what document gave the three branches of government for the national level? Hints being that it was really long, there was 7 articles, I made you read some aspects of it. Well, if you answered the US Constitution and if this was Harry Potter world, then I'd give 10 points to Gryffindor at this point. So just like the US Constitution created the three branches of government, the state constitutions create the three branches of government on the state level. And each state decides what they look like. They decide how many people they want in their House of Representatives. They decide whether or not they even want a House of Representatives. They decide how long their governor serves, if there's term limits, all that different stuff. Here's the Florida Constitution to kind of give you an example. Probably see some similarities where it's like there's a preamble at the beginning and there's also articles with Roman numerals. That's about it. If you remember the Constitution on the US level, it starts with the legislative branch. Florida, it starts with a Declaration of Rights for Florida citizens. You don't see the legislative branch until Article 3. Don't worry, you're not going to need to know the 12 articles of the Florida Constitution, but I did want to make it available for you to see. Just like before, guys, they're there right here. You might want to pause and make sure you fill in those blanks, but let's move on. Now, if I were to ask, like, specifically where in Florida you would find this state government, it's pretty straightforward. It's Tallahassee. There's a reason why we spent all that time learning states and capitals at the beginning of the year, because at those capitals, that's where your state governments are located at. Now let's move on specifically to the legislative branch for the state. So state laws are done in the Florida legislature, or whatever state you're in. It'll just be that state plus legislature. In Florida, we have a two-house legislature. We have a House of Representatives and we have a Senate. Just like the ones in D.C., although not all states do two houses. Nebraska is a good example where they just have one house in their legislative branch. So that kind of begs the argument, senators and representatives again? Yes, but these are different. State senators are senators within a state legislature. Senators that we were talking about in previous units are the ones in Washington, D.C. These guys are in Tallahassee. Each constitution, depending on the state, will determine what the numbers look like as well as how many years they'll serve. So for Florida, you have 40 state senators that serve 4-year terms, which is a little bit different compared to the national level where we only have 2 senators and they serve 6-year terms. For the Florida House of Representatives, we have 120 members in that house and they serve 2-year terms. You might have noticed also in your notes, again, there's a box there. So trying to keep everything in order. We're now talking about the state, and that's the state legislative branch. So go ahead and fill in those things there, as well as this stuff here, like the fact that we have 40 state senators and 120 state reps. Anywho, moving on to the executive branch for the state. Every state has its own version of an executive branch, but instead of a president being the one in charge, you have something known as a governor. For the state of Florida, our current governor is Ron DeSantis. And if you're wondering where this guy lives, well, he lives in the governor's mansion. Just kind of like how the president lives in a White House, our governor gets to live in a mansion in Tallahassee. It looks exactly like this, and if you decide to run for governor one day, well, this house could be yours. Every time the governor leaves, a new person goes in. Now, as far as how long the governor serves, for Florida, it's a 4-year term for 2 terms maximum, which is exactly how the U.S. does it for presidencies. I should warn you, though, that not all states do it this way. Florida's constitution specifically said that this is how it should be done. So if you go to other states and you see governors serve 6-year terms, or some governors have no term limits, that's because that state decided it to be that way. For Florida, we try to keep it simple. Now, as far as what the governor does, pretty much the same thing as the president, but they do it on a state level. They enforce the laws of the state. So whatever the state legislative branch makes as far as laws, the governor will enforce. They have people in a cabinet just like the president has their cabinet. They have a lieutenant governor, they have other agencies, they have people to help out enforce the law like the National Guard, state police. Those state trooper cars that you see, they answer directly to the governor. Speaking of positions, lieutenant governor. This is basically the vice president of the state executive branch. So if the governor were to die or if the governor would be unable to fulfill their duties, then the lieutenant governor would assume the office of governor. Um, Pretty much the exact same thing as the vice president of the United States, but just on the state level. Yet again, the executive branch for the state level is the governor. And our current governor is Ron DeSantis, and he enforces the law. Now let's move on to the judicial branch of the state. Now, if you remember when we were talking about the judicial branch and we went from like, hey, you can go from Palm Beach County Courthouse all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, before you get to that, you would actually end up with the state Supreme Court. Each state has its own version of the Supreme Court. It should be noted that they're not more important than the one in Washington, D.C. Now, do they function the same? Pretty much. As in, there might be a case there and they might have to reach a verdict and it might reach a precedent. The biggest difference is the process on how they are chosen is completely different. Now, the governor will choose the judges, just like the president chooses the Supreme Court justices. However, you guys decide if they stay. So there are 7 justices on the Florida Supreme Court. You got 1 Chief Justice, you got 6 Associate Justice. It's an uneven number, so that way there's never a tie. And when the governor chooses them, they serve for the remaining time the governor is in office. But once that governor leaves, you decide whether or not they stay. And if you do decide that they should stay, then they're elected for a 6-year term, and then you got to vote for them again in 6 years, which is really different compared to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court, it's you get appointed, you're there for life. So there's your 3 branches for the state level. On the judicial for the state level, you have the state Supreme Court, and here's Florida Supreme Court and how it's a little bit different than the U.S. Supreme Court. That being said, let's move on to the local level. Now, just like the states have 3 branches of government, your cities also have 3 branches of government. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about them because depending on what city you're in, it might not be very awesome or cool. It could be very lackluster. So just to recap with the 3 branches of government, if we're looking at on the city level, you have right down at the bottom, you have stuff like a city council, you have a mayor, and you have county courts. Let's start with the legislative one though. So on your local level, whether it be you're in a town, a city, a village, whatever it may be, your city councils are the ones that make the laws for your local level. And these laws only apply for that city or town. And depending the size of the town or city you have, will depend on how many people are actually there. I'll use Royal Palm as an example just because we have a lot of students in Royal Palm. There's only 4 council members in Royal Palm, so it'd be like the legislative branch only has 4 people in it. Biggest difference compared to other legislative branches, though, is they pass something known as ordinances. All an ordinance is a local law that you have to follow in a city. So like if they did something like a dog ordinance, where dogs must be on a leash no longer than 6 feet, that would only apply for the city that it is passed. Other cities wouldn't have to listen to that law, but if you live in that city, you must. So, legislative branch on your local levels, your city, town and city councils. Now, the executive branch is the mayor. And the mayor is a very, very important position for the local level of government. They enforce the laws on the local level in your cities. So whatever your town or city council passes, the mayor will enforce. They'll use local police officers in order to do so. And if you happen to live in West Palm Beach, Florida, Keith James is currently your mayor. If you don't like that, then run for mayor. And finally, our last branch of government on the local level is our county courts. Like I mentioned to you guys when we were doing the judicial branch, that at the end of the day, this is where it all starts. You get arrested, you get detained, you go to trial. And when you're on trial, you'll appear in that courthouse there, Palm Beach County Courthouse. They have original jurisdiction when it comes to crimes, if you remember what jurisdiction is. And you can take your case starting there all the way to either the state Supreme Court or even the U.S. Supreme Court, depending on what it is. There's your notes on the executive and judicial branch on the local level. And here's the chart finally completed where you have all 3 branches of government at all 3 levels. And honestly, that's the conclusion of federalism at this point.